And
I'll just kick this off then. So, kids and philosophy, two things that really mix. Um, it's an obvious, it's an obvious question. I'm surprised it's not been asked before, but uh, you think we should be teaching kids philosophy in schools? Uh, why and from what age? And how is that going to help them in the modern age?
but I think it's a matter of understanding. Okay, so the AI age side of it is we have this really big problem in understanding what's real, right? And we don't know what's true because so many things can be faked. But the reality is propaganda and these things have always been around. And so you're easily manipulated. And so when you look at philosophy, philosophy is the idea of getting to the truth and understanding how thoughts and arguments are made. And so it's basic things like we see in marketing, right? If if I'm taught to respect people of authority, like those with a doctor's uniform on or a nurse's uniform or whatever, and not to question things because, well, they have the authority because they're dressed a certain way, that's a big problem. And there's actually some research on this. I believe it's referenced in the book Nurture Shock that lower income people are less likely to question doctors, and their kids are the same way because they go to the doctor and they have this sort of deference for them. And so they don't say, well, why am I doing that? Or what's the benefit of this? Or what's the long-term impacts or these types of things. Whereas higher income literally teach their children when you go to the doctor, hey, they're just an advisor, right? We trust them and they have good ideas, but that doesn't mean you don't question them. It doesn't mean you don't ask questions. And so understanding the difference between, okay, what is a manipulation or a influential tactic like social proof, right? And how that affects you, or the authority or consistency and all these biases in our minds. Well, philosophy gets down to the core of these things, whether it's first principles or it's understanding what's the difference between inductive and deductive reasoning. A lot of the arguments for AI waking up are inductive arguments, meaning we're inferring them from the information. And most of the details and decisions we make in life are inductive. Like, hey, if the light's green, I can go because every other time the light's been green, I could go and nobody T-boned me. Well, that doesn't actually mean that it's going to be the case. Nobody's going to T-bone me this time. I'm just inferring that that will be the case. Well, and so this is the core of the AI arguments, right? So if I'm saying, okay, humans are just a bunch of atoms, and our intelligence is what makes us unique, and clearly that intelligence is from our brain. If we just repeat the information processing and data storage and neural connections of the brain, I'm going to inductively determine that putting that into a machine is going to come up with the same result. That gets really interesting because we've already seen that isn't true. But most people don't have the framework to think through that and to say, okay, well, is that actually an argument that's rational? No, it's a prediction, it's a hypothesis, it's a guess, but there's no reason to assume that it's just going to be accurate because you're just any more than to say, hey, nobody's ever going to T-bone me at a green light. Like maybe there's a chance. And then honestly, the green light is a higher probability. We've already seen the AI thing is proven wrong because they've already matched the human levels on that. Yes, Rob?
So, I'm interested. You mentioned there about the low income families, and it's been proven, I guess, especially from the US, right, where they don't question authority figures as much. And you mentioned doctors as the example.
I would have to look at the book. I don't remember if it was solely the US. I know several of the studies referenced in that book were from Canada. And I think a few were from the UK, but it's been a while since I read it. Was the book Nurture Shock. Um, and I don't recall specifically which country or countries were referenced in that sort of deference to the authority figures.
Okay, so a question that leads on from that then. I spent a big chunk of my life in Asia, and I lived and worked there. And there is a very high education level in a lot of the first world cities there, Singapore, Hong Kong, big parts of Korea, Japan, Taiwan. But people like me had a job there, primarily to act as the person that would say no to people in authority, because sometimes the decision would be really bad for the business. So, what does that mean for the philosophical teaching that people should, what should kids be learning? Because there's a group of very well educated people that don't always, and I'm not saying 100% of the time, but don't always question authority. And there's been some very high profile, disastrous examples of that, like the Korean airliner and those kinds of
Right.
things. So,
Yeah, that's an excellent example.
what do you think for, like, in response to that? Do you have a particular philosophical teaching that you think people should be the seed that people are learning from?
Yeah, well, they have to understand what is something that is scientific, right? So what is science? It's something that predicts the future perfectly. So if I use kinematic equations of motion. So what does that mean? Got my cell phone here, I throw it across the room, I know the angle, I know the force of which it's flying, I know the resistance of the air and the wind, and I can predict where it's going to fall. If I account for every variable every single time, I'm going to know exactly where that thing's going to fall. Right now, there's a lot of variables when you're talking gravity and Earth's rotation. I mean, you can get to all kinds of levels of specificity, but there's a lot of things that we assume are scientific or that are perfect like that are not. And so, for instance, I mean, I have my oldest is only in second grade, and there have been instances where his teacher has been wrong about something, or at the very least, unclear, right? And the question was asked in a way that it's like, well, this doesn't really make sense, like which way she's going with this. And so you have an option. As a parent, do you say, hey, the teacher's always right? Like, just do what the teacher says. In sports, we generally do, right? The ref doesn't call it or the ref does call it. You don't have a choice. They are the authority. You just do whatever they say. And that totally frustrates my son because he's a rule follower. He just doesn't understand how that can be the case. But with teaching, there is a proper way to say, okay, I either don't get this, I'm misunderstanding your point or angle on this, or I have more questions about this. And that is not only a reasonable thing to do, it's a necessary thing to do to be successful in life. You can't just say, well, because the boss, or because the teacher, or because the doctor, or because whoever did these things. Well, there's a lot of people, I would say across many cultures, maybe in Eastern cultures, it's more prevalent, that don't question any of these authority figures and are afraid to question the boss, and they just talk about him behind their back. I mean, that's why boss is a pejorative term to begin with, right? And so there is a cultural aspect to it, but it's more of, if my son knows it's okay to ask his coach, his teacher, his doctor, hey, why is this? Why do I need to drink less juice? What is, or my dentist or whoever, that becomes a way for them to learn how to navigate in the world better, right? And the philosophical basis for it is they they don't have, in almost every instance, scientific evidence, a perfect airtight reason to say this is the exact way to do it, or this is the exact solution, or this is the only solution, or this is the only option, or those types of things. Does that make sense?
It does. So, from what ages are you saying that kids should be learning this kind of thing?
Well, I think we're already there with my 8-year-old.
Mm.
I would say my 6-year-old, she just turned 6 less than a month ago. Actually, exactly a month ago. She's in kindergarten. There is a level at that, but it's probably somewhere in there. 6 to 8 is when you start saying, "Hey, this is when it makes sense to question things." You know, let's just say in the religious side of things, certain people will get annoyed by lots of questions. I'm the opposite. If you're questioning anything about God, why does this happen or why does that happen or this doesn't make sense to me, that's brilliant. I would love those depth of conversations at any age and any level, not the, hey, this is just the way to do it, right? Oh, this is just what we believe, or this is just right. And that could be whatever your religion could be. I don't believe in God. Okay, well, why do you say that? What about this thing? Like, the asking of questions is paramount in understanding. Okay, well, an argument for or against God is a philosophical argument, for instance. Right? There is no scientific proof one way or the other because you can't measure with science something that's immaterial. Well, understanding that as a young kid, I think actually helps you navigate the lies that you come across. on either side about those things. And I mean, that's probably your most extreme example, I would say, because it is dealing with the metaphysical things that aren't tactile. But it does go all the way down. And I struggle with, so my open question is, okay, what does that look like for my 8-year-old when we have conversations? Like, is there a philosophical framework that I can start teaching him and have conversations about? And I don't know the answer to it. It seems necessary. And a lot of things in science, like, for instance, there was a Chinese scientist who came to the US. I can't remember his name, but he was critiquing some issues with neo-Darwinism. So neo-Darwinism is molecules to man, and hey, that's just sound science and whatever. And he gave some presentations about his critiques, and here's the issues that we see with it, and so on. And after a few of them, he was like, "The audience isn't responding. They're not asking me questions. They're not engaging. Like, what's going on?" And his hosts were like, "Well, you can't really question Darwinism in the US." And he was like, "That's funny. In China, we can't question the government. And in the US, you can't question Darwin." And that's not scientific in any facet, right? Like the whole point of science is to question, is to ask those things. And so if there's things that are cut off, well, you need to understand the difference between an argument that is based in science and an argument that's based on a personal attack, right? If I say you can't have a reasonable opinion on, I don't know, politics because you're the wrong gender or you're the wrong belief system or you're the wrong, those are not reasonable or rational arguments. Those are character arguments. Those are attack arguments. Those understanding the difference in what is a real rational argument. What's a rational argument? It's based on the facts and reason and things you can observe. Whether Chuck is crazy or not is completely irrelevant if his argument is sound. And like that is the core of I would say the philosophical principle. Whether the doctor is a doctor or not, is their argument sound? Whether the dentist or the politician or whoever, and yet the vast majority of society is easily manipulated because we defer and outsource our thinking to whoever it is we admire, the celebrity, the footballer, the uh, politician, the teacher, I mean, whoever. And that's not fair. Or we do just as bad and we argue, well, I don't trust what they're saying about this solution to whatever problem because they're a Christian or they're not a Christian or they're an atheist or they're not an atheist or they're a Muslim or they're whatever. And it's like, wait a sec, their argument on this issue has absolutely nothing to do with their metaphysical point of view. Like equating the two and crossing them is irrational and not a fair system to go. And I can't see a world in which we're worse off when we teach people how much they're being manipulated by falling into irrational arguments. And those are at their core philosophical arguments. This is everything I just said is a philosophical discussion. Does that
At
make
this
sense?
point, I feel like, yeah, I've got a lot of questions, but the main one is, if you feel so strongly and make what I think are really good points, why aren't you running for office, or why aren't you doing something at that kind of level to change things?
Well, here's the irony of it.
There.
To win in office, I would have to do all the things I just said aren't useful or aren't honest to some degree, right? So it is, you would have to get the social proof and you would have to get the backing and you would have to stick to things that are shallow and aren't going to get people to think. I mean, the less substantive it is, the more effective you're going to be because people aren't at that level. So, I have a bigger responsibility to my own children. And so I'm starting there. And I'm starting to figure out, okay, how do I make sure they're educated in a way to know what are reasonable, rational, concrete arguments and what are character attacks and what are other things that don't actually matter. Like in science, there's a popular idea of consensus. Well, every scientific breakthrough came against the consensus, right? Now, it might take time and it might be little pieces that are chipped away at a time that it's not like, oh, we all believe this one thing and all of a sudden there's a completely different, like there could be 1,000 slices to get to that. But the reality is Newtonian mechanics was replaced by relativity pretty abruptly. It was a relatively short amount of time and dramatically. And everything we understood about Newtonian mechanics is kind of like crazy. Like it just isn't real. And then we get to the quantum mechanics, beyond relativity. It's like, oh man, there's a whole different world here. So these things were against the consensus of how reality worked. So this whole idea that, well, we polled a bunch of scientists and they believe this, that's not a scientific method. That's a philosophical discussion. That's a, well, you believe that. That's great that you believe it, but you have to prove it. And the ultimate burden of proof is, can you create a system that replicates that? Right? If I do X and Y, I will predict that Z will happen. If I can't create that, I'm still dealing in a hypothesis situation, a theoretical situation.
So I'm listening to all this. I'm getting really frustrated. I don't have children. One day I would probably like to, assuming that they have a world to come into. But what can the common man do about this? The common person do about this? And I guess this is a question for all three of you, because
Why are you
I
getting
think
frustrated?
because this is another one of those issues where you can really only deal with your own household, right? It's very, very hard to influence people. And even there, you said that to me, I feel like in a lot of areas, we're a peer group, right? We all think in the similar ways. We disagree on some things, but we allow each other to disagree, and that's okay. But we can only really influence our own households. And even then, that's tough. So I'm hearing a lot of fantastic things that would change the way that we live. It would change people's understanding of each other. It would probably lead to people making more money, being better off, being more educated. And those three things go hand in hand. But you can only really do your own tiny piece, which doesn't really affect the whole. There's very few people that can affect the whole, and I think that's the frustrating thing, right? No matter how good their ideas are or how good their rhetoric is, they can only do so much. So that's, I think, where the frustration is. So what can people do at this level? And I think that's definitely for the layman like me, or for people watching, like what could they do?
Well, one of the things that I would say to that is the core of every successful society. So some of the oldest societies were Chinese based in their dynasties and like, thousands of years, always has a very strong family structure. So the idea that uh, all I can do is help my family is has always been true and is probably the most important part of a successful society. And so, one, I wouldn't say that you can only help your family. I would say your priority. So there's a concept in Catholic social teaching called subsidiarity. And so you're focused on the smallest level of decision making. I don't want a president of a country making a decision for my family, right? I need to make that decision. So subsidiarity says that the closest person, the most affected by it with the most knowledge of that particular situation should be making the decision, not so many, many levels and millions of people away. And so these things come together to say, okay, well, if I do that and I have that conversation with my kids, who do they talk to? Or my nieces and nephews, and how does that help them? And so the beauty of it is if everybody appreciated the importance of their roles as parents, as grandparents, as aunts and uncles, to have these discussions, it doesn't take long to have a huge impact. And that's also part of the sort of, you know, disinformation that has happened over time, that societies, and you saw this like with Romanian orphanages. I mean, there was some really interesting studies in there where for a while they thought that the state could raise children better than the family. And I mean, relatively horrific, I think it's fair to say, outcomes came from that. And this wasn't that long ago. This was like the 80s, right? This wasn't significant time ago. And so I don't know that we've completely learned that lesson, right? When we ship our kids off to public schools or private schools or wherever, a lot of parents think, well, they're teaching my kids all they need to know. Well, my wife is a brilliant public school teacher. but she will fully admit, and we understand that we are still the primary teachers of our children. And so there's been that sort of outsourcing, and I don't know if this is worldwide, Rob, you might have a better inclination of that than me. But certainly in the US, that people are somewhat shirking their responsibilities. So, and specifically in the terms of, hey, it's my job to educate my children. So when I say, hey, kids should learn philosophy, absolutely, I hope the school does.
Yeah, but
Whether they do or not is irrelevant to my family and my household. We're gonna have to figure out what that looks like. If we can get their help, I certainly we would, because everything you're going to learn, you said like making more money, right? Well, what are some assumptions people make around that? I'm thinking of people that I know that have graduated from high school recently, and hey, I want to go and make a job, and this job's going to make, 60 grand my first year, and I can work up to make 80 grand. And it's like, okay, well, that's great. You know, what does it look like 40 years from now? It's a trades job is basically where they were talking about. Um, but it was a trade not in their own business, like, hey, I'm going to do roofs or carpentry or whatever. It was a trade within an organization. And so I was like, okay, but what's the upper level to that? How far do you go? And his family situation was such that that's all he'd ever seen. You get your job, you work for 40 years, you work your way up and get your 5% raise a year or 2% raise or whatever. And you have security and that's fine. Nothing wrong with that at all. I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just saying no one has ever questioned, is that reality? And is that the best option? Is that all there is to life type of thing? That's just how they were raised. Now, there is, to be fair, possibly an incentive for schools not to have kids question this many things, um, because you do need people at different levels, and then it gets into the whole, well, how did our school system come into play? And as part of the Industrial Revolution, and we need factory workers and blah blah blah. But yeah, that gets more into politics than how do we affect it today. But hopefully we can agree questioning things and understanding what's a reasonable question, what is science, meaning something that I would say can predict the future accurately. Knowing the difference is crucial. And I don't think I'm that far away from getting those points across to my son. The most difficult one is the referees when they screw up. He just does not get that. Hey, that kid was out of bounds, or that kid tripped me, but when I tripped him, or like it's he struggles with that one. Go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, me too. Well, okay, we've got about, I don't know, 30 seconds left. I definitely would like all three of you to answer this separately. What should people tell their kids tonight, and where should they go if they want to learn more about this kind of stuff?
first, when you talk to your kid, ask them what they did that day, and then tell them you love them. Okay. That's all there is. If you got one thing that you can say to your kids, it's what did you do today? And I love you. What was your other question, Rob?
Where should they go if they want to learn more about this kind of stuff?
Right here, buddy. Talk to dad.
Greg?
So mine is probably to question everything. Because that's really the only way to figure out truth, right, wrong, what's going on, who's telling the truth, how you're approaching things, why you're approaching things, where you're approaching things in certain ways. It's to really just question everything. That is very tough because people have to question themselves. People don't want to question themselves. They want to just believe that they are, great in their own, right? And it's like, no, you have to question your own beliefs, your own thoughts, other people's beliefs, other people's thoughts. Because in reality, that is the base of all philosophy and science, is just to question why. Why is this going the way it is? Why is it, why am I feeling this way? Why is the world acting this way? Why is that ball flying up in the air and coming down in this exact place? So that'd probably be the first thing I start. And I actually wouldn't recommend anyone getting directly into philosophy or any specific philosophical bent right away, because that's the same concept, is you'll be influenced by that. So just by observing the world and asking why, I think is your best way to get to learn and understand the truth. And that's basically the base behind philosophy.
And you'll quickly understand from that, when you ask Rob, why is this a good idea? And he's like, well, because that guy's brilliant. Or why is this a bad idea? And Rob's like, well, that guy's a bum. You can't listen to him. You quickly realize Rob has no idea what he's talking about. Right? Because those aren't rational or reasons. Those are character arguments that have nothing to do with the arguments itself. Yet you'll find a very high percentage of arguments is that's the way people make them. What do I say to my kids? They've all been brainwashed since they could talk. I say, Daddy loves Addie. She's my daughter. And then she responds all the time and forever, no matter what. And so, literally, since they could talk, they all know this. Sometimes I say it together and then they argue, like, I wanted to say it first. uh, but then you live it out, right? Then you have to show them that no matter what, even when you're mad at them, even when they've done something wrong, I'll say, well, what about if don't listen to data? Do I still love you? Honestly, when you do that the first few times, they say no. The kids think that you don't love them when you're mad at them. And so you have to go through the process of saying, no, I still love you. Right. And then, the next week, well, what if you don't put your toys away? And then I'll tease them. Well, yeah, you still love me. Are you sure? But almost universally, the first few times when they're 2, 3 years old, when you say, well, what about when I'm mad at you? They will say, no, then you don't love me. It's a really strange thing to hear. It's very jarring, but that's the perception that the little kids have. And so it's important to reinforce that. As far as where to learn more about this, I don't know. That's my question. I'm trying to figure it out myself. Can talk to Greg. You certainly learned some in our book. Soulless Intelligence dives into this at I would say beyond the 8-year-olds level. It's probably at least the middle school level, maybe early high school. It goes into a lot of these arguments.
All right, that seems like a good place to wrap this up. Do you want to stop recording?